Let's dive right into this explainer and investigate the dramatic, century-long saga of how AT&T became one of the most powerful monopolies in American history. We're going to trace this fascinating journey from Alexander Graham Bell's initial invention all the way to the massive corporate breakup of the telecom giant, affectionately and sometimes fearfully known as Ma Bell.
Seriously? Imagine a world where a single entity controlled absolutely everything about how we communicate. I'm talking about the national long-distance wires, the local neighborhood exchanges, right down to the heavy rotary telephones sitting in your living room. For a whole century, the Bell system completely dominated U.S. communication. So how on earth did one single company gain that kind of unprecedented control?
Well, for decades, economics textbooks have pointed to the telecom industry as the perfect textbook example of a natural monopoly. The basic theory here is that when you have enormous barriers to entry and massive economies of scale, like, say, laying incredibly expensive copper cables coast to coast, a single firm can actually serve consumers at a lower cost than a bunch of competing ones. But as you'll see, economic historians actively challenge that assumption. Take Robert Crandall at the Cato Institute, for instance. He argues that the AT&T monopoly survived into the 1980s, not because it was natural, but because of overt government policy. The sources we're exploring today suggest this monopoly was actually heavily engineered from the top down, rather than just naturally occurring. Which brings us to part one, the spark of invention and the patent monopoly. Back in 1876, when Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone, he basically gained an absolute legal monopoly over the technology. And in a piece of massive historical irony, Western Union, which was the absolute titan of the telegraph industry at the time, was offered Bell's patents for a mere $100,000. And they passed. They completely dismissed the telephone as a passing novelty. Little did they know, this novelty would eventually grow to swallow them whole. Now, what's really interesting here is that during Bell's initial 15-year patent monopoly, the growth of telephone service was actually incredibly sluggish. Service was largely restricted to major city centers and mostly just used by business elites. By the end of this patent period, there were only about 270,000 phones in the entire U.S. And that sharply contrasts with the absolute explosion of connectivity that happened the second that patent finally expired. That takes us right into part two, the era of fierce competition. When Bell's foundational patents expired in the 1890s, the floodgates absolutely opened. We're talking over 6,000 new, independent companies springing up out of nowhere, and as a result, prices completely plummeted. Average daily calls skyrocketed from just 37 per 1,000 people in 1895 to over 391 calls by 1910. That is a tenfold increase in just 15 years, driven purely by fierce open market competition. But this Wild West competition created a really unique problem, and that was the extreme fragmentation of early telecom. These competing networks fiercely refused to connect their lines to one another. So imagine having to own two completely different smartphones today and paying two separate cell phone bills just to text a friend who happens to use a different carrier. It was an absolute logistical nightmare for the average consumer. Enter part three, the universal service solution. This frustrating fragmentation set the perfect stage for AT&T president Theodore Newton Vail. He returned to the company in 1907 and championed a really powerful new vision with a catchy slogan: one system, one policy, universal service. Vail forcefully argued that a fragmented system was completely useless to the public. He proposed that the only way to efficiently connect everyone was through a single, unified, and tightly regulated system. Basically, a monopoly. So how did they pull it off? Part 4. Building the unnatural monopoly. To execute this vision, Vail strategically traded the pressures of free market competition for the sheer safety of government regulation. Just look at this rapid consolidation of power on the timeline. It starts with the 1913 Kingsbury Commitment, which was an antitrust settlement that AT&T somehow actually used to consolidate its power. Then a brief nationalization during World War I. That's followed by the 1921 Willis-Graham Act, explicitly allowing AT&T to buy up its competitors. And it all culminates in the 1934 Communications Act, which officially codified AT&T as a protected national utility. I want to focus really closely on that brief World War I period for a second. On August 1st, 1918, the federal government literally nationalized the telecommunications industry for national security reasons. And the sources point out something wild. AT&T executives actually welcomed this. It guaranteed them a high rate of return, it wiped out any lingering independent competition, and it let the government take all the heat for raising rates. By the time the network was handed back to private hands, AT&T's monopoly was stronger than ever before. And once this vertical monopoly was fully secured, the trap was set. Predatory business practices became perfectly legal. Customers were literally forced to lease their physical phones directly from Bell, paying monthly fees indefinitely. I mean, imagine paying a monthly subscription just to keep a hunk of plastic sitting in your kitchen for 30 years. Plus, it was strictly prohibited to connect any non-Bell equipment to the network whatsoever. You played by their rules, or you didn't have a phone.
Which leads to our final chapter, Part 5, the breakup of Ma Bell.
This iron-fisted control lasted for decades. But eventually, the political and legal winds shifted, and the very same government forces that helped build the monopoly decided it was finally time to tear it down. Following a massive Department of Justice antitrust lawsuit, AT&T officially ceased to exist as a nationwide monopoly in 1984. Through a consent decree, the monolithic Bell system was shattered into 7 independent regional operating companies, which people affectionately dubbed the Baby Bells. But, history has a really funny way of repeating itself. Through decades of subsequent mergers and acquisitions, those scattered Baby Bells eventually started recombining. Today's modern telecommunications landscape is heavily dominated by giants that are direct descendants of that original breakup. We're talking about companies you probably use today, like the new AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink. The pieces of the giant puzzle essentially just snapped right back together into a new formation. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on based on the sources we've reviewed today. Was the century of Ma Bell a necessary, unavoidable step to wire a massive nation and achieve universal connectivity? Or did overt government policies essentially trade away a century of rapid, competitive innovation in exchange for the mere illusion of a natural monopoly? Thanks for exploring this fascinating slice of history with me.